Yo friends, I'm doing a series of videos talking about the design concept permaculture and how I am applying its different principles here on my property. Today we're talking about the permaculture design principle number 4, which is to apply self-regulation and accept feedback. And this one I found the second half of it is just intuitive, and I think it's intuitive to most people who are engaged in the work of growing things. And permaculture is often used for gardeners and small scale farmers. So, this idea of accepting feedback I think just comes naturally. If you put a plant in the ground, if you put a tomato plant in the ground and you find that it's unhappy, your immediate instinct is to ask why and what can I do about it? Why does it look so wilty or droopy? Or why are some of its leaves missing? Or why are there holes in the plant? And what can I do about it? Why is it not as productive as I might expect it to be? And what can I do about it? That is this idea of accepting feedback. And feedback can come from a variety of sources, not just in your garden. So, for example, one area that I have gotten some feedback in and something I've done on the property is at the very beginning of the spring or so, I just really basically kind of carved out some dirt steps down to the creek and then just put a few things of concrete blocks in where those carved out steps were. It was just kind of something I felt like I tossed together, but it was like, oh cool, like I have some steps down to the creek and I don't have to kind of crawl and slide my way down there. Well, just a few weeks after I did this, we got a fairly, not even a heavy rain event, like a medium rain event, and it washed out like that bottom brick and has started to erode some of the hill around the second to the last brick. So I accepted the feedback that was not a smart, long-term solution in building steps down to the creek, and I'll have to find something else. Now, I haven't done anything about it yet, and that's part of my accepting the feedback too, is I'm like, I'm not going to just keep putting this failing system into practice, and instead I'm going to find a solution that's going to last long-term. That's the first part of this design principle. How can we design things in such a way that they are sustainable, that they are long lasting? And I think that is really the key of permaculture as a whole. Permaculture is an idea about permanent agriculture. So how can we put systems into place that produce food and a variety of other important things for us and for the other creatures we're sharing our space with, and how can we put them into practice in a permanent, sustainable way? So that's why a lot of permaculturists don't really spend as much time in the vegetable garden as they do in the orchard. They plant perennial trees and shrubs and perennial vegetables like maybe asparagus or good King Henry, and they don't focus as much time on growing tomatoes. And this idea of sustainable shouldn't really mean that we work ourselves out of the equation. I think it could, but I think it's really more talking about acknowledging that you are an important piece of this property and you are designing the property, so you're already a part of the important equation. And it's more like setting boundaries and setting limits to yourself. For example, you could say, I want to design a system where I grow food for my family, but I only put in about 5 hours a week of work in the system. The sustainable aspect here would be it's sustainable long term for only 5 hours of my time every week. So you might do some things, some of which I've done, where you mulch really heavy, so you have to water less and weed less. You plant perennial plants, so you have to take care of them more, or you plant plants that you have found work really well and easily in your system. For example, I know that garlic, I've just planted tons of garlic and I've completely ignored it, and it's produced a nice big crop for me every year. And then accepting feedback would look something like, oh boy, the garden is just overrun with weeds and my 5 hours a week isn't cutting it. So maybe I then start to change some things. Maybe you accept that you need to put in more time every week, or you come up with creative solutions that involve taking care of the weeds with less work. Maybe you use a weed whacker instead of pulling each one up by hand. Or maybe you plant plants in the weediest areas that you feel like could outcompete the weeds. And as I think about this idea of self-sustaining, I try to think or imagine what would happen if I was on a property that didn't have access to city water or didn't have an easy way for outside people to drop off mulch or compost, and try to think of how can I build and design a system that is water sufficient, is fertilizer sufficient, is mulch sufficient. I love my deep mulches. I love putting thick layers of wood chips everywhere, but I also recognize that it's not sustainable. I'm not really gonna be hauling around giant wheelbarrows full of wood chips in my 90s, and yet I still want to be engaged in this property. So how can I set it up to be sustainable without me hauling giant wheelbarrows of wood chips a couple times a year? One of the things that I'm really looking forward to in this spring, I plan to purchase a good couple hundred, maybe even 1,000 of honeoye strawberry plants, which are really good at growing on their own. They're a nice choice for organic strawberry growers, and I plan to plant them to just cover the front yard where I'm growing a lot of my perennial trees and shrubs. I think eventually, in some of the shadiest areas, as the pear tree, as the apple trees really start to shade in some of that stuff, the strawberries won't be successful. But I think in some of the part shade or the sunnier areas, they will be a nice thick ground cover. I found this at the middle school garden, that the areas that are just covered in strawberries, I don't have to weed as much, like nearly as much. So they also don't need as much watering because they're shading the ground and preventing evaporation. I've thought about pollination and how can I build a system that is self-sustaining in terms of pollination. So, I've put a hive of honeybees on the property. I'm also doing everything I can to use the first principle and observe what seasons of the year don't have flowers in bloom, and then plug those seasons in with flowers. So having a consistent summer-long, spring-long source of nectar for a variety of pollinators, so that I can be ensured that they will pollinate the edible plants I really want them to, as well as the beautiful flowering plants. I'm doing everything I can to ensure that the carbon mass produced here on the property stays on the property. So I'm putting things in a compost pile, which is being spread around the property, or I'm even just putting leaves and small sticks directly on beds that, for larger plants that can handle them, and they'll break down and compost right there. I'm trying to think about water in a sustainable way. The creek is a really great source of water, but it's a lot of work to haul water up from the creek, or it's a fair amount of energy to use a pump to pump it up from the creek. So realistically, it's not that much energy, so I think I'm going to be pretty happy with the pump system for a while. I might upgrade to a larger pump so I can spend less time with it and it will pump faster. But I'm also thinking about how can I, capture the rainwater from the roof here and use it for watering the plants. Of course, we could do rain barrels, but as I was thinking about this video and thinking about this design principle, I was like, oh, maybe I can find a more efficient way that involves less of my time to water things. So maybe just having the rain from the roof directly spread out into the garden somehow. Or maybe it does fill up a very large rain barrel, and then I have the rain barrel hooked up with a drip irrigation system that goes off automatically on a timer. Something that I can just set it and forget it, and all of my plants in the front yard right near the house are watered efficiently. Thinking about firewood on the property long term and sustainably. I've talked about this in other videos, but I am pollarding a few black locust trees. So instead of cutting down the entire tree and grinding up the stump, you cut it down at above browse height for deer, and it will send up shoots. Then those shoots will thicken into small branches and medium branches, at which point you can cut them down, and it'll just keep doing this. So maybe every 5 or 10 years I have a cycle where I can cut down a number of branches, and I have poles for using for things like shovels, or I have branches that I can chop up and use for firewood. Now that's not enough for heating my house all winter long. I would need a larger property for that, but it's something, and it's something small. I can also use those smaller branches for mulching and things like that. Talking about accepting feedback, one of the things I've found is that where the house is and where the driveway is, God, the driveway is just unbearably hot in the summer. So I'm doing a few things to capture that heat and redirect that heat, or take advantage of the heat. One of the things I'm doing is planting figs right along the driveway. They're going to love the heat. They're going to love it. Another thing I'm doing is planting some apple trees on the other side of the driveway. And some of them I'm planting on pretty large rootstocks, or even on their own roots, and expecting the trees to get very big, and will then shade the driveway for most of the morning and early afternoon. So that would prevent it from getting so unbearably hot. In terms of the nursery, I know it's just not sustainable for me to purchase seeds from someone else every year. So as I find plants I'm really interested in, and really interested in propagating and selling and giving away, I am installing those plants on my own property to create my own seeds, to create my own source of cuttings. I really, really enjoy elderberry, and I'm really interested in expanding the elderberry gene pool. So I'm planting a number of named variety elderberry on the property so that I can take cuttings from them and propagate them and clone them to people. But then I'm also expecting to be able to harvest seed from these elderberry and start new plants that have really high genetic parentage. I'm doing the same with pawpaws and hazelnuts, and I would love to have some pecan trees on the property. So I'm creating a sustainable source of seed for the nursery long term. One of the biggest ways I have accepted feedback this year is in the veggie garden. I'm getting so much feedback that it desperately needs to be protected from deer. I wasn't able to grow anything this year because the deer pressure was so hard. I put some things in place to try to stop the deer or slow them down. I was accepting that feedback and responding to it, and nothing really worked. And I realized that I could keep trying things, or I could just dump a good chunk of change into building an 8-foot tall fence that surrounds the whole side yard property, and that's what I ended up doing. So I'll upload some videos of that as over the next few months as I start to build that fence. I hope to have that fence fully installed by spring so I can grow some tomatoes finally on my property. I would love to hear what you guys think. Are there more things I should be doing in this idea, in this principle? What are some things that you're doing on your own properties or at home to ensure self-regulation or to accept feedback? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe. I'd love to engage with you guys. Have an awesome week.